There is a moment that tends to go unnoticed. It doesn't happen in lecture halls or boardrooms. It rarely happens in public at all. It happens in private, usually late at night, when someone realizes that the system they've trusted to guide them isn't actually designed to lead them anywhere meaningful. And in that moment, something subtle shifts. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change the direction of a life. What's strange is that from the outside, nothing looks different. The same routines continue, the same conversations, the same polite participation in structures that promise progress. But internally, a fracture has formed. A question begins to linger. If the path is so reliable, why does it feel like it leads nowhere? Most people suppress that question. A few follow it, and those who follow it tend to disappear for a while. Not socially, but intellectually. They stop asking what they're supposed to learn and start asking what is actually worth knowing. That distinction seems small. It isn't. Because it quietly dismantles one of the most persistent illusions modern society depends on. The illusion that knowledge is something granted, rather than taken. There is a story people are taught early, though it is rarely framed as a story. It presents itself as common sense. You begin at the bottom. You follow the structure. You absorb what is given. You prove your understanding through approved channels. And eventually, you are allowed to participate in something larger. It feels fair, predictable, rational, and it works, at least on the surface. But there is an uncomfortable detail embedded within it. The system does not reward understanding as much as it rewards compliance with its version of understanding. That difference is easy to miss until you encounter someone who never fully participated in the system to begin with. They tend to behave differently. They don't ask for permission to explore an idea. They don't hesitate before entering domains they were never formally trained in. They often lack the language of institutions, but compensate with something else, a kind of directness, a willingness to test reality without waiting for validation. At first, this can look like ignorance, and sometimes it is, but not always. Which raises a more unsettling question. Why do individuals without formal pathways sometimes outperform those who followed them perfectly? The answer is not as flattering as people would like to believe. It has less to do with intelligence, and more to do with psychological conditioning. Institutional learning, for all its advantages, shapes behavior in very specific ways. It teaches individuals to wait for the right curriculum, the right authority, the right moment to be evaluated. Over time, this waiting becomes internalized. People begin to hesitate, not because they lack ability, but because they have been trained to associate action with permission. And once that association is established, it is difficult to break. Because breaking it feels like stepping outside of something legitimate. There is a subtle fear embedded in that. Not fear of failure exactly, but fear of acting without authorization, which is in many ways a fear of social exclusion. This is where things become more revealing. Because human beings are not primarily driven by logic when they make decisions about learning or action. They are driven by status. Status is an invisible currency, but it governs behavior with remarkable precision. It determines what people consider respectable, what risks feel acceptable, what paths feel legitimate. Following a structured educational route carries social approval. It signals discipline, intelligence, conformity to shared expectations. Stepping outside of it, especially without visible success, carries ambiguity. And ambiguity is dangerous in status hierarchies, because it cannot be easily categorized. This is why self-directed individuals are often dismissed early, not necessarily because they are wrong, but because they are difficult to place. And anything difficult to place tends to be resisted. This resistance is not new. It appears consistently throughout history, often in ways that only become obvious in hindsight. There is something almost paradoxical about how innovation tends to emerge. It rarely comes from those who are most aligned with existing systems. More often it comes from those who exist slightly outside of them. Not completely detached, but not fully absorbed either. This position creates a peculiar advantage. It allows an individual to see the structure without being entirely shaped by it. And that difference, small as it seems, can alter how problems are approached. Because when someone is not bound by established frameworks, they are less constrained by what is considered correct. They are more likely to test assumptions directly, to approach problems from unconventional angles, to ask questions that seem naive, but are often foundational. And occasionally, those questions reveal something others have overlooked. There is an example that illustrates this dynamic in a way that is difficult to ignore. A man born into conditions where formal education was not just inaccessible, but actively discouraged. For him, learning was not an obligation. It was a form of resistance. Literacy was not a requirement. It was a risk, and yet he pursued it anyway. Not through structured guidance, but through fragments. Conversations, observations, scraps of text. There was no curriculum, no validation, no guarantee of outcome, only necessity. And necessity has a way of sharpening attention. What emerges in such conditions is not passive knowledge, but active understanding, because everything learned is immediately tied to survival or transformation. This is very different from how most people experience learning, which raises another question that tends to linger. Does urgency shape intelligence more than structure does? Psychologically, the answer appears to be yes. When learning is driven by immediate relevance, the brain prioritizes it differently. It encodes information more deeply. It connects it to action. It tests it against reality. This creates a feedback loop that is difficult to replicate in environments where consequences are delayed or abstract. In structured systems, failure is often symbolic. A grade, a score, a temporary setback. In self-directed environments, failure tends to be more tangible. Something breaks, an opportunity is lost, a mistake has visible consequences. This difference changes how individuals relate to knowledge. It becomes less about accumulation and more about application, less about correctness and more about effectiveness. Over time, this produces a distinct psychological profile, one that is less concerned with appearing knowledgeable and more concerned with being capable. And capability, unlike credentials, is difficult to ignore. But this is where the narrative becomes more complicated, because the advantages of self-directed learning are not purely intellectual. They are also psychological. There is a kind of detachment that develops when someone is not anchored to institutional validation. They are less dependent on external approval, less influenced by authority signals, less inclined to accept ideas simply because they are presented by someone with status. This can lead to mistakes. It can also lead to breakthroughs, because it allows for a level of independent thinking that is difficult to sustain within rigid hierarchies. Hierarchies by design, reward agreement, not necessarily truth. And over time, this creates a subtle distortion, where individuals begin to prioritize alignment over accuracy. This is not always conscious, but it is consistent, and it helps explain why certain ideas persist longer than they should, and why others struggle to emerge. There is a concept explored in depth by Carl Jung, the idea of the shadow. The aspects of human nature that are repressed, ignored, or denied, but never truly disappear. They operate beneath the surface, influencing behavior in ways that are not immediately visible. In many ways, self-directed learning occupies a similar psychological space. It exists outside of formal recognition. It is not always acknowledged as legitimate, and yet it exerts influence, quietly, persistently, sometimes uncomfortably, because it challenges the assumption that authority is the primary source of truth, and that assumption is deeply embedded in most social structures. Historically, those who questioned authority too directly were not always welcomed. Niccolo Machiavelli observed something similar in the context of power. He noted that systems tend to preserve themselves, often at the expense of innovation, not because they are malicious, but because stability is valued. Predictability is valued, and individuals who operate outside of established norms introduce unpredictability, which makes them difficult to trust until they succeed. at which point they are often reinterpreted as exceptional, rather than examined as evidence of a broader pattern. That pattern becomes easier to recognize in modern environments, particularly in places where information is no longer scarce. The traditional gatekeepers, institutions, publishers, formal authorities, no longer control access in the same way they once did. And yet behavior has not fully adapted to this shift. Many people still act as though permission is required, as though legitimacy must be granted, even when the tools to act independently are readily available. This creates an unusual dynamic, where opportunity exists, but is underutilized, not because it is hidden, but because it does not come with clear instructions. And without instructions, many hesitate. This hesitation is not a flaw in character. It is a learned response, a byproduct of environments where deviation is subtly discouraged, where certainty is rewarded more than exploration, where being wrong carries more visible consequences than not trying at all. Over time, this shapes behavior in predictable ways. People become cautious, measured, reluctant to engage with uncertainty unless guided. And while this can be useful in stable systems, it becomes limiting in environments that are constantly changing. Which brings us back to the earlier question. Why do some individuals, without formal structure, seem to adapt more quickly? It may have less to do with what they know, and more to do with how they approach not knowing. There is a tolerance for confusion that develops when someone is used to learning without guidance, a willingness to sit with incomplete understanding, to experiment, to fail repeatedly without interpreting it as a reflection of identity. This is psychologically demanding. It requires a certain detachment from external validation, but it also creates resilience, because it shifts the focus from avoiding failure to extracting information from it. In contemporary environments, this pattern appears in subtle ways. In workplaces, individuals who take initiative without waiting for instruction often rise faster. Not always because they are more skilled, but because they are more willing to act. In social settings, those who are less dependent on approval tend to navigate dynamics more fluidly. On digital platforms, creators who experiment rapidly often outpace those who wait for perfect conditions. These are not separate phenomena. They reflect the same underlying mechanism, a reduced reliance on permission, and an increased tolerance for uncertainty. None of this suggests that structured learning is without value. It provides foundation, context, access to accumulated knowledge, but it also shapes perception. And when that shaping goes unexamined, it can become restrictive. Understanding this is not an invitation to reject structure entirely. It is an invitation to recognize its limitations, to see where it supports growth and where it quietly constrains it. There is a temptation when discussing these ideas to frame them in terms of superiority, to suggest that one path is inherently better than the other. But that misses the point. The distinction is not moral, it is psychological. It is about how individuals relate to knowledge, authority, and uncertainty, and how those relationships influence behavior over time. Because in the end, what determines influence is not how much someone has been taught, but how effectively they can engage with reality, how quickly they can adapt, how clearly they can think, how independently they can act. These are not traits that can be fully conferred. They have to be developed, often in ways that are uncomfortable, often outside of structured environments. So perhaps the more accurate observation is not that self-taught individuals rule anything, but that they operate differently. They are less anchored to existing systems, less dependent on established pathways, more willing to navigate uncertainty without guarantees. And in a world where conditions are constantly shifting, that difference becomes increasingly significant, which leaves a final question, not about education, not about institutions, but about orientation. When faced with uncertainty, do you wait to be shown the way, or do you begin, even without clarity, and accept the cost of figuring it out as you go? There isn't a universally correct answer, but there are consequences to each, and those consequences tend to accumulate quietly, long before they become visible to anyone else.